The discovery of the self is to suddenly realize what the self is. And the self is, of course, the background of our own existence. The self is the innermost I and the innermost awareness in us that sees everything, that knows everything. It's so important to see that we are not the personality structure. I mean, we are not the personhood. We are not the person that we think that we are. The person that we think that we are is an instrument. It's a creation. It's a product that we have created through upbringing, through growing up in society, through growing up in the world, where we needed to position ourselves in order to survive, and people needed to call us something in order to organize the different individuals. We are characterized and defined, labeled and analyzed in a way because that's how we organize society. That's how we organize the variety of individuals that exists together. But the true self in the human being is the innermost background awareness who sees and knows everything about the activity that takes place within that individual. I mean, I know that I have a creation in me that is the person in me. My artist profile, my philosopher profile, the guru function, the therapist, the pedagogue, the writer, the meditator, the monk, the aesthetic strategy developer, the developer of aesthetic strategies. There are so many different functions that we have, so many different things that we identify with. And if you're really sick, if you get cancer or something like that, then you become the person who has cancer. I am the person who had really bad luck and got cancer. We identify with these things. Oh, I am the person who broke my leg. Because consciousness or awareness or attention goes where the pain is. Attention in our mind goes where the pain is. That happens automatically. So if your pain and your sorrow and your trauma, if your trauma is in the cancer, then your attention is going to go to the cancer. If you have another trauma, your attention is going to go to that trauma, and you're going to identify with that trauma. And the reason why that trauma is going to be painful for you is because that trauma is a story. And the story is, I am the person who got cancer. I am the person who was completely abused by my own parents. I am the person who were never seen and only rejected and treated with the utmost disrespect by a group of narcissist people without any self-knowledge whatsoever. We will attach to the story that is true for us, how we experience it emotionally and psychologically, and our attention will go there, and we identify with it. I am this person. I am the person who has this story. I'm the person who carries the story of my life trauma, or I'm the person who carries the story of how I got cancer, of how I'm the person whose entire family disappeared and perished in a plane crash. We identify with that because that's the trauma. Our attention goes to where the pain is. And so the identification process starts not only because we are presented with the label, I am this, I'm Christian, I'm da-da-da, I'm da-da-da. It's not only that, it's not, we don't identify ourselves with thoughts, with thinking products, with our, let's say, exterior conceptions. We don't identify with that, and because of the labels that we are given and because of the labels that we ourselves produce only. That is one part of it. That is perhaps 50% of it. And then the other 50% of it, or 60% of it, is the trauma, is the pain. Our attention goes where our pain is, or our fear. What are we afraid of? Our fears are connected to the stories that we live by. We have usually everyone has a story that we believe is true about our life, and this story makes us either happy, sad, or traumatized. The story serves us in a good, nourishing, protective way, or it sabotages our own existence because the story is so painful. you know And so that's how the different narratives of our lives serves us. Some narratives serves us in a good way. Other narratives are disastrous. They are suicide. They are self-sabotage at the highest level. And those stories are, of course, those who are connected to trauma and to tragedy and to loss, to the sad things. And we, of course, everyone, we need to grieve, and we need trauma therapy. Every person in this world needs trauma therapy in one way or another, and some people need it, of course, much more than others, because we all have suffered different kind of nuts. We all have suffered different kinds of neuroses. We all have suffered different kinds of experiences which traumatized us. And after the traumatization, after the trauma, we developed a neurosis in the nervous system and in the brain, and because of that neurosis in the nervous system, we develop PTSD or complex PTSD, and this PTSD and this complex PTSD, which basically everyone suffers from to a smaller or larger degree, that PTSD will make it practically impossible for you to disidentify with the pain, because the brain produces a lot of activity around that pain, and the PTSD reflex, the stress reflex, or the cortisol stuff that is activated, is creating so much stress that it's just simply not possible for the nervous system to regulate itself back to the normal balance state. And it is through the normal balance state that we can experience and see and discover the true self. Because without that balance, we cannot really see it. And people usually live in PTSD. People usually live in complex PTSD. This is not an exaggeration. It's going to be more and more a fact. And complex PTSD is the diagnosis of the 21st century, without a doubt. There is no diagnosis in this world who is more prevalent than complex PTSD. And after 30, 40, 50 years, the whole world is going to know it. Complex PTSD is the diagnosis for the future, because it is true, and it also shows us what the nervous system and the brain is actually doing and how they are controlling the human being. And without the balance that you need in order to see yourself clearly, you cannot really discover the self, the true self, because the true self is not you, it's not who you are, it's not me, it's not who I am. It's not even an inner being. It sounds maybe silly to say it, but yes, it is actually true that it is a divine entity. It is a divine entity. It is a divine, and it is the divine entity within us, which that from which everything originates. Everything is sucked into the self. It's like a subtle centrifuge. The self is a subtle centrifuge that collects the world, like a bee collects honey, or not honey, but what is it? They collect something from the flowers when they're flying around. We collect something from the earth, from nature, in order to survive. Food, or protons, or atoms, or waves, particles, lights. We have the self, which is the true self inside us, is a self that really cannot be explained. It's a very subtle mechanism. It's a very subtle mechanism, but it is from that everything originates. And when we are out of PTSD, when we are out of stress reactions, we can see that the self conveys itself to us. When we see it, we discover it. We see, that's it. The self is that in me that can see everything else. The self in me is that which can see how another part of me, or the thinker in me, creates all these kinds of concepts and conceptions that I, again, later on, identify with as a part of my identity structure. The self knows that. The self can see that yes, that's what's happening. But it doesn't judge. It doesn't make any judgment. It doesn't give any information about it. The false self, the false self, the thing that we identify with, the thinker, or the production, the factory self, the idea self, the mind self, the factory self, the thing that we identify with, that self, of course, is the judge, and that self produces judgments all the time. But the true self is that from which everything originates. And everything comes back to that self. It starts there and it ends there. It is the beginning and the end. It's the Alpha and the Omega, as it says in the Bible. And the kingdom of God is inside you, as they say. And of course, in India, many people say that true self is God. True self is what God is. So, we might say then that true self is what God is, because everything comes from that and everything ends with that. It is the Alpha Omega. When we release ourselves from everything else, from all our programs, from all the algorithms that control us, from all our desires, thinkings, and feelings, then we are with what's left, and what's left is the true self. When everything else is gone, the true self is left. When everything else is gone, the true self is left. And that's the discovery of the self. That's when we discover the self. When everything else is gone, then we discover the true self, the nature of the true self. So, my point in this talk is also to really have to say something about trauma and PTSD, that true self and trauma are of course two completely different things, but sometimes we have to understand that you cannot talk about true self without also understanding what trauma is, because trauma is a disruption of balance. Trauma is what takes us out of true self, in a way, if we speak very subtly, in the very sensitive way. Everything that brings disruption to the self if we see everything that brings disruption to the self as some kind of a trauma, which of course we cannot do that because it's too subtle and too sensitive, but let's do it just as a metaphor, you know. If we do it just as a metaphor, then we will understand that this is basically the fundamentals of life, you know, true self and trauma. That is the world or life. Life revolves around the core center of true self and trauma, because true self and trauma are something that exists together. And when you get serious trauma, damaging trauma, serious trauma, then you will develop PTSD. And that PTSD will make it impossible for you to discover the true self, because your brain is going to be full of stress and full of anxiety, and you're going to have panic attacks, and you're going to get completely out of balance, and your nervous system is completely dysregulated, your brain is completely dysregulated because of the PTSD that is caused by the trauma. And under all of this, underneath all of this is the true self, and we cannot see that, we cannot connect with that if we are in the PTSD state, if we are in the stressful state that occurs because we're living in, we're usually in this century, maybe 80% of the world population lives with some kind of complex PTSD. Some kind of complex PTSD, 80% of the population have. 20% of the population have it quite seriously. 10% of the population really have it seriously. 5% of the population have it much more seriously than they understand themselves. And 2% of the population simply die or perish because of that PTSD that just simply is killing them in some form, some way or another. And PTSD and complex PTSD is the reason for so many psychological illnesses that stems from PTSD, that they originates from PTSD. They originates from trauma and PTSD, and it's called a variety of things. There are many diagnoses on top of this situation, but the underlying issue is complex PTSD after traumatic incidents to the brain and nervous system and to the mind and to the true self and all of this. So I just wanted to say something about that. Discover the true self. Let it be what it is. Open yourself to it. Let it reveal itself. Let the true self reveal itself, and let yourself fall into the true self. Let yourself merge with the true self that is the essence behind the essence, the self behind the self, the I behind the I. And release yourself from the PTSD structures that is harmful to everything, because it's just causing stress. And that is what trauma therapy is about, in a way. And a lot of people need that. A lot of people need trauma therapy, but the majority of the people who need trauma therapy, they don't realize it, they don't see it. But the true self is there, and it welcomes everyone, and it's basically the same in every person. It's the same true self in everyone. It's just that we cover it up in different ways. We cover it up in different ways, and we inhabit the different pockets of identity structures and identity programs in different ways. The different pockets of identification that we ourselves produce. We inhabit those pockets in different ways, and that's what happens, you know. We create different pockets inside the mental universe, and we inhabit these mental pockets with our own creation, our own personas, our own temporary creations in the form of personas. We create a whole lot of different persona incarnations inside these pockets. The persona incarnation that we create all the time is in itself, in a way, a program inside a pocket like that. But we can be free from that, and we can see that. We can see that structure from what it is. We can see that activity for what it is, and we can release ourselves from it when we accept the existence, or let's say the nature of the true self as it is in itself, and that's enough. We don't need more than that. We don't need more than that. It's the balance state. It's the original balance state in who we are, or in what, let's say, or in that which is very central. That this is the essence, the core essence in that which is essential to every human being. It's good that people agrees and disagrees on what we are, what the human being is, and it's good that we disagree about what is God, what is true self, what is the soul, what is the heart, what is left, what is right, what is green, what is blue, what is yellow, what is red. It's good that we disagree about that, because disagreement creates knowledge. But anyway, let true self be what it is, and try to release yourself from the endless amount of persona incarnations that we ourselves creates as a way of surviving in the world, through communication, through positioning ourselves within the domain of communication in society. In a way, we have to do it, but we don't have to get stuck. We don't have to get addicted to this activity, to this communication practice, to this way of presenting ourselves, because we can also just be as we are and be what we are. Okay, thank you.